Hi viewers, I.M. News reporting Mohammed Shoaib. Weight of history putting the fight against Putin's aggression in broader terms, declaring the battle between democracy and autocracy is the test of all time. Biden also issued a blunt warning to Vladimir Putin that any attack on NATO, this news YouTube condition adds friendly territory, would be met with the full force of the alliance's collective power, and he denounced Russia's leader with what seemed to be a call for him to be ousted from power, a dictator bent on rebuilding an empire. Will never erase the people's love for liberty. For God's sake, this man cannot remain power, the White House quickly clarified, issuing a statement that despite what he said, President Biden is not actually calling for regime change in Moscow. Our senior national correspondent Terry Moran was with the president for part of his trip. He starts us off from Lviv. Good morning, Terry. Good morning, John. This city has taken in hundreds of thousands of people who fled their homes elsewhere in Ukraine, and you can see it and feel it here. The streets are thrown with people, traffic at a standstill in many places, but those missile attacks here yesterday, one just about a mile north to us, the other a mile south to us over here, they're the fiercest attacks yet. The mayor of Lviv calling them, quote, greetings from the Russian aggressor to President Biden, who was across the border in Poland at Warsaw Castle in Poland. President Biden declared that today's war in Ukraine is a battle between democracy and autocracy, between liberty and repression, between a rules-based order and one governed by brute force. The president summoning free nations to a new cause, a new and dangerous 21st century struggle. History shows this is the task of our time, the task of this generation. Goal is simply to take control of the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine. That's a far cry from Vladimir Putin's vow to demilitarize and denazify all of Ukraine, which sounded a lot like regime allies, in a sense that suddenly everything has changed in Europe. It's a pivotal moment in history. I asked NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg about growing concerns that Russia might use chemical weapons. Any use of chemical weapons would be totally unacceptable, will be a blatant violation of international law, and will finally change the nature of the conflict. But Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is urging NATO to do more, asking in an address to Ukrainians last night, what is NATO? Ukrainians, because as the missile attacks in the U levied show, there is no real safe haven in Ukraine, and why Ukrainian forces have checked Russian advances mostly around the country. They are taking heavy losses too, and that's why President Zelensky keeps asking for more, because if this war grinds on, those forces will need more weapons, more help, a lot more. John. Terry Moran in Lviv this morning. Thank you, Terry. Joining us now is Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister, a top advisor to President Zelensky, Olga Stephanie. Madam Deputy Prime Minister, thank you for joining us. You heard President Biden's words. This declaration, we stand with you, period. Speaking to you, speaking to all of Ukraine. Do those words match the actions that we're seeing from the United States and from NATO? Well, first of all, its address was to Ukrainian people, not only to the Ukrainian leadership, and it was really important because in this time of the severe war and nearly all possible war crimes has been committed against the country, but also against Ukrainian people, it was really important to have the sense of international leadership and understanding of the tragedy which is happening there. For us, we have also heard a very important messages related to the war crimes committed in our territory, and the clear understanding and in readiness to form the anti-war coalition led by strongest democracies in the world to stop the war and to stop the aggressive terroristic regime in Russia. But there's clear frustration that we're hearing from President Zelensky. I mean, just yesterday he was saying he was expressing frustration with NATO, even saying, is it being run by Russia? Why can't he get all you need? What more do you need? You as you stand there right now in Kiev, what more do you need to defend yourselves against this aggression? Well, first of all of these messages, they should not be perceived as, well, we have this discussion. It's really important that the West and the leaders of European nations, most of them are there already, understand that Ukraine shall get any possible assistance, including military, to be capable to defend itself and to hold the European sky safe, while the broader political consensus of how to stop this aggression is there. So everybody should be concentrated over one goal, to make sure that Ukraine is capable, financially stable, to resist and defend until the political solution, how to restore the territorial integrity of a Ukraine and a peace around the Europe, is there. What can you tell us is the latest out of Mariupol? We hear just horrific reports of no electricity, of no food or water running out, Russians taking over neighborhoods, taking people out of the country. What is the very latest? I would start by saying a couple of very important elements of free tax. First of All its more than 80 towns and villages around out of their more than 150,000 of people, too many of them are still remain there. This news YouTube condition ads friendly. They don't have access to water, to any food supplies, to anything. More than 85% of whole town is destroyed, so it simply does not exist anymore. While people there, and they then some of them has been forcefully displaced to Russian Federation, and this is even worse than being in a humanitarian crisis in a city. Given all of that, is there any sign of any even glimmer of hope on negotiations with the Russians? And you've heard people speculate, you know that you know perhaps NATO, perhaps Ukraine needs to make concessions, rule out joining NATO, or even us ceding a Crimea or the territories in the east. Could you is any of that on the table? The idea of rewarding the Russians for all of this by ceding territory in the east, well, Russians has naturally put everything on a table, while they're like absolutely clear red lines for Ukraine, and these are red lines first of all for Ukrainian people, but also for the whole world, because now we have the decision of the International Court of Justice abiding Russian Federation to stop the military operation and to refrain from any military action. So this is one point where no discussions are possible. Second element, that there's new discussions which are possible as regards territorial integrity and serenity and inevitability of Ukrainian territory, and of course Ukraine will never step up for any element of discussions which would anyhow legitimize all the war crimes which has been committed in Ukrainian territory. Thank you, Madam Deputy Prime Minister, and thank you for your resolve and your bravery. Appreciate your time. Let's bring in former CIA Director and retired 4-star General David Petraeus. General Petraeus, first of all, let's pick up what we just heard there. The idea that giving any concessions as part of negotiations with Russia would be rewarding basically their terrorism that they've rained down upon the Ukrainian people. Yeah, I mean, it indicates that the Venn diagrams, if you will, what's acceptable, in other words, to President Putin and also President Zelensky, there's still very little overlap, if any. Basically what you have is a president in Moscow who's watching his economy, his financial system hit. West of that, where a ship was hit and destroyed, Russian ship, they'll now have quite a good port on the Sea of Azov out to the Black Sea, and then it will free up a number of battalions that were the ones that have been closing the circle, closing the noose on Mariupol, who can then push further north and perhaps enable Russia to achieve what it has now set as it's redefined its objectives, to taking control of all of the Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast provinces, if you will, and then solidifying its grip on a land corridor from the Donbass, from those two oblasts all the way to Crimea. So this is going to be a very tenuous period the next few days as we see what happens in Mariupol, what the Russians are able to do as a result of it, and then how the Ukrainians can respond, because it's a very long distance from anywhere where they might have forces that they could possibly spare. And of course, in the meantime, very understandably, President Zelensky, who, despite hearing this extraordinary commitment from President Biden and from all the leaders of NATO at the summit this past week, nonetheless, once more, and I fully understand that, I mean, he's like a battlefield commander, and no commander has ever had enough forces, drones, air force, whatever it may be, and that's the position in which he finds himself. And we should understand that, and what we need to do is provide everything we can that can be provided without needlessly provoking a direct confrontation with Russia. I very much understand President Biden's concerns about that. Let me ask you about that, because we saw President Biden's speech in Warsaw outlined this basically as the struggle, the fight of our time, but there was that line at the end of his speech where he said flatly that Putin must go, this man must not remain in power. Obviously that's not the policy, but how does something like that vary for and made headlines all around the world? How does that complicate the efforts to resolve this situation? Well, I mean, it reminds us that message discipline has its virtues. That was reportedly very clearly an unscripted moment, in addition in the emotion of that very emotional moment, and you know it will cause some challenges down the road. It will be disappear, you know, the headlines will move on to something else within a few days. But in the mind of Putin, to someone who has, you know, watched and re-watched, you know, old videos of Gaddafi being taken and killed, this kind of thing, it will play on his mind, and it could complicate matters going down the road. Look, I think President Biden would be the first, knowing him, he'd be the first to say, oops, you know, okay, hey guys, okay, well, let's get on with it, and let this should not overshadow what was an extraordinarily important and successful trip to Europe, one that the U.S. really led, as it has done so impressively really throughout this entire effort, and pulled together, guided, and then ultimately with this speech that did, it was a very, very strong statement. Obviously, I want to ask you a little flashback here to a statement made by the president of Poland visiting Tbilisi, Georgia, after the Russians invaded Georgia back in 2008. A statement that echoes today. He said at that time again, this is 2008 today, Georgia tomorrow, Ukraine the day after tomorrow, the Baltic states, and later perhaps time will come from my country Poland. Obviously you know Ukraine did come. Is there a concern here that whatever ends up resolving this, if there is a resolution here with the Russians backing down, that giving them, rewarding them in any way for this is ultimately a green light for Putin's ultimate plan to rebuild the Russian Empire. John, I tend to think that this has complicated any ambitions that he might have had very considerably. This is going to set back his military for years. It's shown the whole world that it wasn't the wonderfully modernized force that everybody thought it might be. This has been a huge challenge for the Russians. The fact that they've lost 7 generals just because they can't command and control sufficiently. They have to get out of their armored vehicles and model forward to find out why are they stopped again, this kind of thing. So I tend to think that his ambitions are going to be seriously set back by what takes place in Ukraine, noting that this is by no means nearing a conclusion. All right, General David Petraeus, thank you very much for joining us on This Week. Coming up is Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson moves one step closer to joining the Supreme Court. Clarence Thomas is facing new scrutiny about his wife's involvement in attempts to overturn the 2020 election. We'll discuss the fallout with Senator Amy Klobuchar next January 6th commission or anything related to our effort to hold individuals accountable for their participation in this attack on our democracy. Justice Thomas can make his decisions like he's made him every other time. It's his decision based upon law. If he sees it not upholding the Constitution, he'll rule against it. Some reaction to those extraordinary text messages revealing that Jenny Thomas, the conservative activist married to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, urged Donald Trump's White House chief of staff to overturn the 2020 election. In the days and weeks after the vote, just as Trump and his allies were promising to take their case to the Supreme Court. Here to discuss that and more is Senator Amy Klobuchar, member of the Judiciary Committee. Before we get to matters related to the Supreme Court, I want to ask you about President Biden's speech and that line that we all heard him say very bluntly, this man Vladimir Putin cannot remain in power. I mean, wasn't he saying exactly what he believed? First, the White House has clarified that he was talking about the region and that he was talking about that Vladimir Putin has got to stay out of NATO countries, something he specifically said in his speech. But I think General Petraeus said was meaningful here. We know the policy of our country, we know what it is. I think Vladimir Putin knows what it is, and certainly our NATO allies and Americans know what it is. We're part of NATO. We're doing all we can to protect those NATO countries, doubling the number of troops in Poland that I just visited a few weeks ago. Incredible command there, incredible leadership, giving them significant military assistance that is so necessary, and we have done a lot and we should do more. But beyond that, our policy is clear. NATO is a defensive alliance. The president has said it himself, and we will do all we can to help Ukraine, and you can see the strength of that help coming through with the fact that they've literally pushed Russian troops back from Kyiv, and that message came through. But as you know, during the campaign, I mean, you ran against Joe Biden, you know full well what he said. He said the words of a president matter, and that was the headline around the world. That was the message heard in Moscow. That's what the Russians are responding to, and would ever walk back there is his words. Yes, cannot remain in power. Having stood there myself on that border and embraced those kids, the refugees coming and hearing about the horror they leave there with nothing on their know of, leaving everything they have behind, everything, their little stuffed animals and their backpacks, moms with suitcases leaving their husbands behind to fight. Yes, the moment is clear. Vladimir Putin is a monster, but the position of the United States government is not to send troops in there. It is to give all the aid we can to Ukraine, which includes Switchblade drones, incredible drones that have done a lot of damage to the Russian army. And you've got to the Russian planes, you've got Stingers, 800 more Stingers, thousands of more Javelins, and we're doing more and more and more, and we must. I have personally advocated for doing more. That's what this is, and it's the humanitarian aid, over $1 billion pledge, taking in 100,000 refugees. That is what we are doing, and it's not regime change in Moscow, but it's been made very clear. Okay, let's turn to matters related to the High Court. You saw those text messages from Jenny Thomas, Clarence Thomas's wife. I want to read just 2 of them. One on November 6th, she said, do not concede, it takes time for the army who is gathering for his back. And then on November 19th, sounds like Sidney, meaning Sidney Powell, and her team are getting inundated with evidence of fraud. Make a plan, release the Kraken, and save us from the left taking American down. I mean, my goodness, Jonathan, the facts are clear here. This is unbelievable. You have the wife of a sitting Supreme Court justice advocating for an insurrection, advocating for overturning a legal election to the sitting president's chief of staff, and she also knows this election these cases are going to come before her husband. This is a textbook case for removing him, recusing him from these decisions, and I don't think all I hear is silence from the Supreme Court right now, and that better change in the coming week, because every other federal judge in the country except Supreme Court justices would have a guidance from ethics rules that says you got to recuse himself. Thomas himself recused himself in 1995 from a case involving a school because his son was going to that school. Justice Breyer refused himself when his wife was on the board of an entity, and that case became before the Supreme Court, and if he doesn't recuse himself, the entire integrity of the court is on the line here, and they had better speak out on this, because you cannot have a justice hearing cases related to this election. And in fact, the ethics rules that apply to all the other federal judges say that if it involves a family member, appearance of impartiality, they have to recuse themselves. So not only should he recuse himself, but this Supreme Court badly needs ethics rules. Chris Murphy's leading a bill have long been on supportive of that, says basically get your act together, get ethics rules in place, and I would hope Justice Roberts, who I respect, will stand up and get those ethics rules in place. They've got to do that. They should do it themselves, right? So Ketanji Brown Jackson, some fascinating questions from your Republican colleagues, but Joe Manchin's on board. Her confirmation seems to be given. Is she going to get Republican support? What are you hearing? I think she is. She has in every other nomination that she's had for various levels of the courts, and I would make very clear here, she's not going to get confirmed in 2 years. She's not going to get confirmed in 2 months. She's going to get confirmed in 2 weeks, and so much of that has to do with her vast experience, more judicial experience, and for the justices that currently sit on that court, but also the pillar of strength, how she handled those attacks and just sat there and answered their questions. And she literally is the first black woman to serve on the Supreme Court. When she walks into that court with her head held high, every little girl and boy in America is going to know that anything and everything is possible. It is clear that the overall majority of Republicans will vote against her. Lindsey Graham, in an interview with the Washington Post, said that when all Democrats voted against Amy Coney Barrett, they set a precedent. This is what he said, is that the new norm, if that's going to be the new norm, what do you do when one party has the Senate and the other party has the White House? How do you ever get anybody confirmed? What has happened to this process? We had Scalia overwhelmingly confirmed Ruth Bader Ginsburg overwhelmingly confirmed us, Sandra Day O'Connor. Now we were gonna have a court where nobody had the majority of both parties. I'm not gonna relitigate the whole past, but remember the unique circumstances with Amy Coney Barrett, where Mitch McConnell shoved through that nomination right before an election. That aside, what we have here is someone who is highly qualified, who has gotten votes of Republicans in the past, and those Republicans, at least 2 of them, have issued positive statements in the months leading up to this hearing, and so I believe she will get Republican support. I can't tell you who, I can't tell you how much, but I think that will be very important to this process. All right, Senator Amy Klobuchar, thank you for being here on set with us on this week. Thank you. It's great to be on. Jonathan, the roundtable weighs in next. Plus 538's Nate Silver on the political fallout from. We'll discuss the hearings with our roundtable after this analysis from 538's Nate Silver. Let's start with a simple fact. Ketanji Brown Jackson is a popular nominee according to Gallup polling. 58 of Americans want the Senate to vote to confirm her. That's the second highest figure for any nominee Gallup has tested since 1987. It's also true that 30% of Americans oppose Jackson's confirmation in the same poll. Still, her net rating of plus 28 is higher than other recent nominees like Brett Kavanaugh, who was a plus 4, or Amy Coney Barrett at a plus 5. In an election where Republicans have a lot of things going for them, that means they're taking a real risk. Supreme Court confirmation votes are one of the most important things the Senate does, and they can swing Senate races in 2020. For instance, Maine Senator Susan Collins unexpectedly held onto her seat after voting against Barrett, who was relatively unpopular in Maine, and in 2018 several red state Democrats, including Missouri's Claire McCaskill and Indiana's Joe Donnelly, may have sealed their losing fates after voting against Kavanaugh. Part of the risk for Republicans could be uniting the Democratic base, which has been split over issues like Coven. 88 of Democrats favor KBJ's confirmation, while just 7% oppose. It could also motivate black Democrats after the party failed to deliver on promises like voting rights. Still, with President Biden's accrual numbers among black voters having slipped into the mid-60s, there is room for improvement overall. I buy this one. Reflexive partisan opposition may be the norm for Supreme Court nominations these days, but that doesn't mean it's politically wise. Thanks to Nate for that. The round table is here. We'll be right back. It will not be easy. There will be cost. But it's a price we have to pay, because the darkness that drives hypocrisy is ultimately no match for the flame of liberty that lights the souls of free people everywhere. President Biden speaking in Poland yesterday. Here to discuss that and more, Ramesh Pannuru, the new editor of the National Review, former DNC chair Donna Brazil, the Atlantic editor-in-chief Jeffrey Goldberg, and Wall Street Journal national security reporter Vivian Salama. Donna, that speech in Warsaw, the White House really raised expectations for it. This was a major address. Obviously he said this is the fight of all time. Yes, did he meet the moment? I thought so. Some people describe it as Churchillian, some other. It was inspiring, it was powerful. He spoke to me. I don't know if he spoke to others when he said, "Be not afraid," quoting Pope John Paul. He said every generation must choose this battle, and democracy is the battle of our lifetime. It was powerful. I know everyone is focusing on those 9 words, "for God's sake," but I think we should focus on the core message is that the United States will stand with our NATO allies. The United States has committed more resources to help the Ukrainians, and that the country understood its role in this battle well. We'll get to those 9 words in a minute, but Ramesh, he did outline this is basically the ultimate struggle of our time, and seemed to be saying this is long, this is about much more than Ukraine, and this is not going to be over anytime soon. The very broad outlines of his policy, I think, commands a consensus in the country that is we are going to support the Ukrainians and we're going to avoid a direct military conflict. I think the debate in the U.S. has been over the parameters of that. So are we supporting enough? Do we need to do more? Do we need to do less? And then the execution of it, and I think that's where we get back into those 9 words. I think that did create some doubt about whether President Biden is in control of his own administration or in control of himself at all times. I think that it is not good if you have a Churchillian speech followed by cleanup from your own administration, and Jeffrey, the cleanup, so the 9 words, of course, that he must go, he must not remain in power, meaning Vladimir Putin, for God's sakes, he must not remain in power. And then the White House comes out and says no, he wasn't calling for, he wasn't calling for me to move from power. At that point they probably should not have walked it back and just left it out there ambiguously, or not ambiguously as the case may be. The argument that we're hearing is that he didn't mean what the plain meaning of the words right are, and and it is. I mean, look, this speech was a very powerful speech. It's true. It is also true that when you're calling for regime change in a nuclear state, that's a policy that you might want to think through before you do it. And Joe Biden is a veteran of the Obama administration, obviously understood that how presidents can get tripped up by rhetorical flourishes. President Obama and the red line, for instance, and it was a response to a question. It wasn't a plan, right? And all sympathy to Joe Biden. These trips are difficult. This is an emotional moment, and of course how could you not want a monster, a person he describes as a monster, to be removed? Nevertheless, this is a nuclear power, and a person who's in a corner and has nuclear weapons is a more dangerous foe than one who doesn't feel like he's in a total corner. And so it's a tough moment. And quote, another thing from Biden: president's words matter. But Vivian, is there any doubt that he was not saying what he believes President Biden is going to say, what President Biden wants to say? And so it is important, and we've seen this actually in the last couple of weeks. He called up President Putin a war criminal before they officially came out and declared, as from the State Department, that they believed that Russian forces were committing war crimes. He also called him a butcher this weekend, and so you don't necessarily see that reflecting in official U.S. policy. But obviously the president is going to go out there and he's going to basically project what he believes. The White House has said it all along. Even with his war criminal comments, they said he was speaking from the heart. And so this is something that President Biden has a history of doing. But whether or not U.S. foreign policy will officially reflect that remains to be seen. Something like calling for regime change, or even just suggesting the notion of regime change, has a lot of landmines. The U.S. has obviously a dark cloud over it for a long history of seeming like they are meddling in other countries' affairs and trying. Even suggesting regime change suggests that the US would somehow get involved in that. And so obviously U.S. foreign policy very careful to not suggest that, because that creates a lot of problems down the line for the US. To think about his audience. His audience was the entire world, including the Russian people, and he spoke directly to them. I know, look, you are not our enemies, right? That's right. And we all know that Mr. Putin doesn't like opposition. I mean, he's eliminated most of the opposition in Russia. I mean, We know what happens when the Russian people stand up against their government and their leader, so I do believe that this was a real important moment for America to not just lead on the issue of democracy but also lead the international community, and I believe overall his trip was a successful trip because he did what we wanted him. I think Americans what we wanted him to do what's to show leadership on the international stage. It's hard to take issue with his characterization of Putin as a butcher or as a war criminal, or even his desire that he be ultimately removed from power, but how do you get from those words to a solution? Any kind of a diplomatic solution is, where does this go, and then the other problem is if you do have an announced policy of regime change or wish a regime change, just that raises the question, so what's the plan? How are you going to do this? Which is another reason you don't want to get into this territory. Right now I think we are looking at continued bloody stalemate, and it is, there are no signs that is going to change, and we're going to be, I think, probably having the same basic kind of conversation next week and the week after. Well, wasn't it just haunting to see those missile strikes in Lviv, just what, 40-50 miles from NATO's border, right at a time when Biden had just been there, right? So just to add something to what Donna said, this is an extraordinarily emotional trip for Joe Biden. He's at the end of the trip, he's seen his refugees, he's seen horrors, and so it's completely understandable that you want the monster to go, and and just to add on to sort of the framing that you provided that says that overall it was a successful trip. If you really look at it, you sort of step back or step up, America in some ways is back. I hate to use sort of the sloganeering version of that, but European country after European country wants the us behind it right by its side. The Polish people are very, very happy to see an American president. Things have become clarified, and this trip was very, very useful in terms of clarifying who the free people of Europe want on their side and who they're scared of, so that was all very useful. And of course Putin is playing right into it by firing missiles at Lviv, by behaving like a monster. So it's all, in the broader context, it was obviously a successful trip and something that he should do again and again and again to remind the world that America is fundamentally different than Russia and also China. John, just to directly answer that question as well, President Putin knows that he can kind of go up to the line without crossing it, and that crossing being to hit a NATO country. This is something that is a margin of error. What completely so, and it's obviously, we see now that he has no real boundaries as far as invading a sovereign country and just the extent of the damage that he has inflicted upon Ukraine. But this is also something that President Vladimir Zelensky has been insisting all along, is that we are not part of NATO, and so ultimately, regardless of anything, even if he gets within 5 miles of the Polish border, we are on our own because we are not part of NATO, and NATO will not act unless it is actually hit. We might say, just a quick note, we might see in the fullness of time that the most important thing that Joe Biden said in that speech was not 1 inch, that it was a very direct and forceful reminder to Russia that in a cross into NATO territory all bets are off, and that was, let's face it, a red line. Even if you didn't say, well, that is, but that's a stated red line that actually exists. All right, I want to turn to Jenny Thomas, Clarence Thomas's wife, and in her text messages I want to highlight one other text message. This is one that she sent to Mark Meadows, Chief of Staff, on January 10th. We are living through what feels like the end of America. Most of us are disgusted with the VP. She's talking about Mike Pence and are in listening mode to see where to fight with our teams. Those who attack the Capitol are not representative of our great team of patriots. For DJT, Ramesh, explain what is this? Well, this is a conservative activist who went pretty far down the rabbit hole of conspiratorial thinking and apocalyptic thinking, and was encouraged by then President Trump to believe a lot of nonsense about what had happened in the 2020 election. Is that so, Pence? So Trump was encouraging her, she was encouraging, who? Where was the nonsense running to end from? Well, it may have been one of those echo chamber sorts of things where people spin themselves up and spin one another up. So yeah, it's very dismaying, and in fact what she took what was one of the most honorable and shining moments of Vice President Pence's career, when he stood up to the pressure and fulfilled his constitutional duty and said that she was disgusted by it, and I think that it speaks very, very poorly about her judgment. Senator Clover made a pretty powerful case, it seems, for Thomas to recuse himself. Do you agree with that? I think whether Justice Thomas recuses himself in a future case is going to have to depend on the facts of that case. If it's something that involves specific records involving his wife, then I think he's going to have to recuse himself, but there's now also this appearance of impropriety question which is going to affect how he evaluates any of those future cases, and frankly I would not be surprised if the Supreme Court were that much more likely to want to stay out of future cases involving the January 6th committee. For example, you know, when Justice Roberts concluded that a press report of the exchange between Mr. Gorsuch and Ms. Sotomayor was an error, the Supreme Court put up a statement, right? I would hope that they would put out a statement now, a statement saying why, a statement to the fact that the judge, Justice Thomas, won't recuse himself on any cases involving the January, but that's not the court to say. That's Thomas. Yes, it is, but I still believe that there needs to be a statement. Look, I think she was unhinged. I know she's a conservative activist. I'm an activist. Yeah, that went really over the top. Seriously, you could have a great career on Twitter. I mean that would be a good place, but you know the point of going to your question. Justice Roberts could walk down the hall and just pop into Justice Thomas's chambers and says, we have a little bit of a mess and I would like to say something about this, but the Supreme Court is self-regulating. We know that. The Supreme Court sets its important land not by guided by, that's why it's supreme, you know. I mean it's they are in charge of their own ethics and they are in charge of their own appearance, and they've got a problem. Yeah, but to the question of impropriety, there's already this lingering question over Justice Thomas because of the fact that he was the only justice to block the January 6 committee from getting into voted former President Trump's papers, and so you already have this lingering over him. And now for future cases as well, there's going to be intense scrutiny about any decisions he's making that has any link to what happened. And Donald, before I've got to get your thoughts on the Ketanji Brown Jackson confirmation. We were promised by a minority leader, McConnell, that it would be a fair process free of rancor and within 30 me about your religion, you're religious, there's no religious test. And then of course the other one, define a woman, and the best one was, and you know, for me to watch these proceedings, to quote Dr. King, and then to turn Dr. King into somebody who's against the people who are still fighting for that dream. Yeah, that's pretty, but it was, but this put this focus on child pornography and pedophiles cooling on. I mean, there was a message. The QAnon was, these are not major cases, these were sentencing decisions. I think that we had a confirmation process where the conclusion that she's going to get confirmed was pretty much foregone by everybody, and so a few Republicans wanted to take some shots and make some political points, and some Democrats found it in their interest to act as though those people represented the entire Republican Party, and that was what the entire confirmation hearing was about, when in fact the majority of the questioning was not only normal but kind of anticlimactic majority. I mean, there was a lot of questioning on pedophiles. Anyway, we're out of time. Thank you very much to the round table. We will be right back. This news YouTube condition ads friendly.